The chain links were the first thing they saw, caught in the harsh beam of a ranger's flashlight, like the sudden shimmer of a fish deep under black water, a gleam that refused to resolve into sense until the light held steady. And then it was undeniable: iron sunk into bark, steel that had fused with the skin of a tree, and bound within it the skeletal remains of two people who had once walked into the Smoky Mountains and never returned. A father and his son. Their names were Jack Harper and his 11-year-old boy Benjamin. For 3 years, the Harpers had been nothing more than questions. Their faces were printed on missing posters that curled in the rain, and their names were read at vigils where candles guttered out in paper cups. Search teams had combed the ridges, reporters had filed their stories, and hope had thinned into ritual. Now the mountain had given them back, but not with mercy, not with clarity. Instead, the forest revealed a tableau meant to disturb: father and son shackled upright, as though someone had staged them as part of a message no one wanted to read. Fog hung low over the clearing that night, thick and wet, smelling of rot, moss, and creekstone. An owl called once from somewhere in the dark, then stopped, as if silenced by what the woods had chosen to show. The ranger who found them couldn't speak at first. The eye always recognizes faster than the mind, and the stomach always knows before the tongue can form a word. Around the base of the tree lay the artifacts that made the discovery even more unbearable: the torn strap of a nylon pack, a wool cap washed pale by seasons of weather, and a toy soldier, its plastic worn almost white by rain and frost. Benjamin's wrists were shackled high, Jack's lower, the arrangement cruelly deliberate. This was not chaos. This was a choice. Whoever had done this had not been content to end two lives. They had displayed them, composed them into something staged and sinister. Later, investigators would study the growth of the bark around the chains, counting back through the years the tree had swallowed them whole. They would collect cigarette filters, broken glass, and beer tabs, proof that someone had returned here again and again to stand before this hidden place. But in that first minute, under the hiss of radios and the press of fog, only two truths mattered. Jack and Benjamin Harper had been gone for 3 years, and now they had been found. The call went out, summoning quiet figures who moved like mourners. Every step was measured, because they knew the ground was its own witness, and every footprint overwrote its testimony. Their task was to copy the record before it disappeared, and in their deliberate work, the past began to slide forward, memory rushing into the present, forcing the story open again. On the day they vanished, the Smokies had worn their ordinary disguise: clouds trailing against ridges, sky, the flat gray of wet slate. It was the kind of day that made strangers invisible, and perhaps that was what Jack wanted. That morning he had checked out of a rented cabin, 3 nights into a trip he had promised would be good for them both. He told the clerk they'd take one last hike before driving home to Knoxville. He smiled, but the smile was stretched too thin. Benjamin, his hands lost in oversized mittens, waved on their way out. He asked the woman if bears slept with their eyes open, and if rivers had beginnings you could stand beside. The clerk, who had learned to read burdens in the way people carried their bags, felt a splinter of unease she could not name. She would not speak of it until years later, when it was far too late. There was one more sighting. At a trailhead where a wooden board promised a loop, a waterfall, and a history lesson, they bought granola bars and a folded paper map from a roadside store, though their phones could have done the job. A fishing guide remembered Benjamin's red cap because his own boy wore one just like it. And then, nothing. No more witnesses. No more signs. The mountain had breathed them in. The first night passed, with easy explanations. A wrong turn, a twisted ankle, a father carrying his son home by the faint light of a phone screen. But by the second day, comfort frayed. Search teams stretched across ridges, radios spitting coordinates, dogs straining at the scents of moss and mud. Hope walked beside them, masquerading as certainty. but the ground offered nothing. A boot print, dissolved in rain. A coin beside a stream. A palm pressed into wet stone. Small enough to believe it was Benjamin's, until the team lead pointed at the larger boot marks near it and shook her head. Helicopters hammered at the fog and failed. Drones whined overhead and found nothing but canopy. At the fire hall, volunteers brought casseroles, and a wall map bloomed with red string until it looked more like a nervous system than a plan. And still, there was nothing. So the theories grew. Jack had debts. Jack was losing custody. Jack wanted to disappear into the hills and take Benjamin with him. Or else, a stranger on the trail. A truck where no truck should be. A scream smothered by fog. A woman swore she heard a boy crying across a ravine at dusk. A trail camera caught a blur that could have been anyone, or nothing at all. Weeks blurred into months. Posters browned and curled. Sympathy soured into frustration. People don't vanish for years, they said. People don't chain themselves to trees. And yet the Smokies kept their silence, holding Jack and Benjamin Harper like a secret. It wasn't ready to give up until the night the Rangers' light struck iron, and the mountain began to speak. The chains sang a history the mountain had not bothered to record anywhere else. When daylight came and the fog unraveled, the scene surrendered detail by reluctant detail. Steel embedded in cambium. Bark folded over links like scar tissue. A sliver of lichen, the color of old money, blooming along one edge of iron. The forensic botanist knelt and traced a gloved finger where wood swallowed metal, counting back seasons the way a dowser listens for water. 3 summers, maybe a little more. Long enough for nesting warblers to learn to avoid this tree. Long enough for storms to come and go while 2 names floated in the mouths of strangers and never landed. The ground told its own story in objects dropped and recovered. 2 cigarette filters matted into the soil beneath last year's leaves. A short length of sun-bleached paracord with a knot that was all function and no ornament. The plastic lips of a sports bottle trapped beneath a rut of deer tracks, and a gold foil crinkle from a candy bar that hadn't been made locally for years. Around the clearing, small rectangles of flattened moss showed where boots had stood, not once, but many times, patient and regular like a ritual. Whoever had brought Jack and Benjamin here had not left them to anonymity. They had returned. They had checked. They had come back enough that the forest had begun to adapt to their rhythm, and in that adaptation was the outline of a person they could not yet name. A ranger, with the steady hands of a locksmith, examined the hardware, not hardware a hiker would carry. The chain was farm store stock, weather-hardened, and sold by the foot off a spool, in places that also sold barbed wire and salt blocks. The shackles, though, were older and pitted with age, with one hinge repaired with a modern screw. A hybrid of old and new. An improvisation built by someone who used what they had and didn't care what it looked like, so long as it held. Photographs clicked, lenses inhaled light, and the clearing slowly emptied. The evidence traveled to rooms with white walls and controlled air while the news gathered its breath. By midnight, phones were chiming across counties with alerts that began with "remains found" and ended with the phrase that disconnected hope from reality, positively identified, in kitchens and break rooms. Faces on posters became faces in headlines. In one apartment a mile from the river, a woman who had once loved Jack sat down on the floor and pressed her palm to a photo on her refrigerator door until the magnet slid and the picture drifted to the tile. People reached for answers as quickly as they reached for condolences, because mystery is a wound that begs stitching by any hand. The early theories elbowed each other under fluorescent lights. A drifter with a camp in the backcountry, a loner who hunted boar in states that allowed it and crossed into the Smokies for silence. A collector of metal, a collector of people. The mountain was full of cabins not on maps and miles of roads that were never meant to be. Everyone knew someone who knew of a shack with smoke and no address. Everyone had driven past a gate made of pipe and chain, and 2 padlocks, with the paint still bright. And then there was the other theory, the one no one wanted to say out loud, but always hung at the edge of any story like this, that the father had done it. It was a theory that thrived in comment sections and died in the air the moment it was spoken beside the chain-gnawed tree. The arrangement refuted it. The growth refuted it. The paracord knots and the bottles and the boot-worn ellipses in the moss. Any man who had set this stage would have needed to haunt it for years. To believe that theory was to believe Jack had visited his own display and stood where the moss remembered. The detective assigned to the renewed investigation had lived in these hills long enough to understand how grandeur hides utilities. He moved through the folders that survived the first search, cataloged each small report no one had thought important then, and watched them flare with significance now. A hiker who had heard chains clink at dusk one November, a sound she thought was a cowbell until she remembered there were no cows up here. A vlogger's footage of a weathered pickup parked behind a service gate with a faded decal on the window in the shape of a hawk's head. A school custodian who had found a child's red cap in a culvert 2 winters after the disappearance and hadn't bothered to report it because the mountain ate hats like candy. It was the detective who traveled to the feed store at the edge of town where the chain might have been sold. The owner was a grandmother with grease on her thumbs and receipts going back 20 years, printed on slick paper that curled like sleeping worms. She remembered faces better than she remembered names. She remembered a man who bought chain by the yard and asked for a cutter to make it easy to trim later. She remembered because he had counted the links under his breath as she pulled them from the spool. Not inches links. What did he look like? The detective asked. Like everyone does in here, she said, and she was not being coy. Carhartt, ball cap, sunglasses on the bill, a beard that could go either way, backwoods or barbershop. The receipt was cash. The camera above the register had been dead for months. When the detective left, she stood at the door and watched the late sun wash the parking lot orange. After a minute, she called after him. He had a limp, not big, just a little drag on the right foot when he turned. A single detail that was not a name. In parallel, the lab built their own biography of the unknown. The cigarette filters were cheap menthols. The paper scabbed with saliva. The DNA was there, but thin, degraded, and mixed with the rain and the soil and the curious invasions of deer and raccoons. Not a clean profile, a whisper of one. Enough, perhaps, to match a name, if a name ever presented itself. The knot on the paracord told another story. Not a Boy Scout knot, not decorative, not the kind you learn from the back of a camping package. It was a constrictor with a half hitch tucked hard against it, fast to tie, hard to see, and brutal to loosen. Common in freight work. Common among people who lash things to truck beds because they have to hold on a bad road. The detective drew a circle on a map, not around the tree, but around the paved lot of a building down in the valley, where the interstate screamed by and trailers rolled in, with their faces full of bugs. If the knot belonged there, then maybe the man who tied it did too. While the investigation turned and turned, the story backed up and showed its edges in other rooms. A school counselor who had once met with Jack because Benjamin had been sketching mountains with trees that grew eyes. The counselor's notes recorded frustration that reads, in hindsight, like a warning none of them understood. Father attentive, tired, insists boy is safe with him, mentions someone watching from a trailhead the week before. The boy used the phrase, the man with the tin voice. Tin voice, the counselor had written, adding a question mark that meant it was a child's poetry for something she could not translate. It sat unread for 3 years, until the bodies pulled it forward into the light again. Thin voice. A clue, or a metaphor, or both. The detective began calling diesel shops. He asked about men with limps and voices crushed flat by a throat ruined on unfiltered smoke or an accident that carved a scar behind the jaw. He asked about the decal of the hawk's head because the vlogger's footage had caught it sharply before the lens refocused on the waterfall. The decal belonged to a small hauling company no longer alive, except in the prints of old invoices where the hawk's head soared above a phone number that did not ring. But the number had once belonged to a man who rented a bay in a cinder-block garage near a salvage yard. He had left 3 winters ago. The landlord remembered the limp more than the face. She remembered the right boot dragged when he was tired. She had always thought it was a hip. The detective stood in the empty bay looking at nothing but oil tattoos on cement, and a single screw drilled into a stud with a twist of paracord still knotted around it. He recognized the knot. He brushed it with his glove, and the tail came away dusty and brittle and perfect for the lab. Outside, a truck rumbled past with its muffler loose and its voice metallic, a banged-up resonance that put a word in his mouth without his permission. Tin. He followed the sound until it disappeared into a wash of other engines, then drove back to the station, where the technician handed him an envelope and said, "You're going to want to see this." Under the fluorescent hum of the station, the envelope looked ordinary, thin enough to fold into a back pocket. The detective slid it with his thumb and shook out the contents. A printout, grainy graphs, and a page of notes written in the careful penmanship of a forensic analyst who knew her words might one day sit on a courtroom screen. The DNA from the paracord matched the fragment from the cigarette filters. 2 different samples from the same man. Not a ghost, not an echo, not chance contamination. The same hand that had tied knots to hold freight had smoked menthols by the tree where Jack and Benjamin Harper had been left to weather and vanish. It wasn't enough for a name, but it was enough to make the unknown a person, someone who could be touched, someone who could be found. The detective pressed his palm against the printout as though heat could coax the rest of the identity from it. He thought of Benjamin, small wrists lifted toward bark, and Jack's broad shoulders slumping in a position that must have been chosen for him. He thought of the years in between, the birthdays never celebrated, the string of first days at school that never happened, and the silence that had filled houses and calendars. All of it contained in a knot, tied by a man who dragged his right foot when he was tired. The investigation bent toward the garage where that fragment of paracord had been found. The bay smelled faintly of old gasoline, even after years of disuse. Oil stains spread like continents on the cement. On one wall, someone had scrawled dates in grease pencil, each one tallied with a line, then crossed through. Not invoices, not rent reminders, just months crossed off like a prisoner carving time. In the corner stood a rusted tool chest, with drawers half open and empty, except for a strip of tape marked with a name that wasn't a name at all. Tin. The detective called it in, the syllable sour in his mouth. Tin. It echoed the phrase from the counselor's notes, the words Benjamin had given her. The man with the tin voice. Suddenly, what had once been dismissed as a child's metaphor twisted into prophecy. Tin wasn't a fragment. It was a moniker. A name spoken somewhere a boy should have felt safe but hadn't. The detective traced it outward, looking for employment records, arrest sheets, and service rosters. Tin appeared in whispers, as graffiti behind a bar that had closed 5 years earlier, and as a scribble on the margin of a logbook for truckers who swapped runs without receipts. The town had a way of erasing men who wanted to disappear. They lived on couches, in trailers at the edges of fields, and in cabs parked overnight in lots where no one asked questions. They left behind the faintest graffiti of themselves, and then nothing. The detective leaned into that absence, mapping the gaps more than the records. He knew enough to see the silhouette of someone who had worked hard at vanishing before anyone thought to look for him. While the hunt for tin twisted outward, the Harper's story folded back into the public eye. The discovery made them newly vivid, no longer faces softening on weathered posters. Jack's sister stood on a porch in a coat too thin for the wind and told reporters about her brother's patience, about the way he once spent 6 hours teaching Benjamin to cast a line without snagging the bank. A neighbor remembered Jack hammering a basketball hoop into the edge of the driveway and staying out long after dusk, while Benjamin threw bricks, each one closer than the last. The stories humanized what the crime had turned into symbols. They gave weight to bones and made the chains feel heavier still. The detectives kept the investigation's shape hidden, but rumors seeped like water through drywall. People began to whisper about the limp, about a man who smoked too much and laughed too rarely. One woman swore she had seen him at a diner near the state line, stirring sugar into his coffee until the spoon clinked like a bell. A retired driver remembered a hitchhiker with a voice as flat as a muffler dragging on asphalt. A local cop recalled breaking up a fight outside a bar, one of the men quick with his fists, but slower when he walked away. None of it was proof, but together it formed a mosaic, enough for the detective to believe Tin wasn't a shadow at all, but a man who still breathed the same air, still bought his cigarettes with cash, and still dragged his foot through parking lots when he thought no one was looking. Late one night, the detective drove the back roads where the mountains pressed close and cell reception vanished. He pulled to the shoulder and cut his engine, listening to the silence until it roared. He thought about the chains and the tree, about bark swallowing metal, and about how long it takes for the wilderness to erase a human act. And he wondered if Tin had chosen that spot, not for its seclusion, but for its patience, because the mountain would hide what men could not bear to see by dawn. The detective knew he was chasing more than a limp and a cigarette brand. He was chasing a man who believed the forest was his accomplice, and that belief had held true for 3 long years, until the tree gave up its secret. The detective turned the key, the car shuddered awake, and he drove back toward town, where case files waited like unanswered questions, and a name written on tape still demanded to be turned into flesh and blood. The morning briefings in the sheriff's office had shifted. What once felt like a ritual of dead ends and polite nods had turned electric, a sense of forward momentum pulsing through the stale coffee and whirring fluorescent lights. On the wall, the crime scene photographs still hung chains corroded into bark, fragments of cloth, evidence tags like punctuation marks on tragedy. But now there were fresh additions. A blurry image of a man at a gas station camera, the curve of his shoulder under a torn jacket, the faint outline of a limp as he carried a case of beer to a battered pickup. Beside it, the name is written in block letters, Tin. The detective studied the photograph with a concentration that bordered on reverence. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was present. Tin had been here, buying cheap beer in the middle of the night, unaware or uncaring that a camera was watching. The footage had surfaced only because a clerk's brother remembered rumors about the limp. That brother happened to work for a small security company, and after days of rewinding digital tapes, he found the ghost they all hunted, rendered in pixels and static. The image traveled fast. By noon, officers across 3 counties carried it in their shirt pockets, studying it during slow stretches on patrol. Truck stop workers tacked copies behind their counters. Even hunters, men who prided themselves on minding their own business, folded the photograph into their maps. Tin was no longer just a moniker in a file. He was a face, a slouch, and a set of habits waiting to be recognized. While the hunt intensified, Benjamin's voice returned through recordings made years earlier. The counselor who had spoken with him had preserved the sessions, noting that his small, halting sentences carried weight no one could measure at the time. Tin talks quiet, Benjamin had said, like his mouth is full of rocks. In another session, he whispered, he smells like fire. The detective replayed these words late at night, trying to piece together an olfactory memory from a child too young to know he was cataloging evidence. Smoke, grease, maybe kerosene? Each detail turned into another strand in the net, closing around the man they hunted. The search for Tin wasn't confined to the present tense. The team pulled open old files, arrest records from counties that barely existed on maps, and reports scribbled by deputies long retired. In one box, beneath layers of dust, they found a citation for illegal dumping. The signature was near illegible, the letters jagged, but the description of the violator fit. Male, early 40s at the time, with a limp in his right leg. The citation was dated 7 years before Jack and Benjamin vanished. Back then, no one had considered him more than a nuisance tossing trash along back roads. Now the record felt like prophecy. For Jack's family, each development struck like a tide, first lifting hope, then drowning it in fresh grief. His sister clung to the photo of the man at the gas station, staring at it as though she could wrest an answer from the blurred pixels. Jack's father, older now, and bent by years of not knowing, stood on his porch during interviews, his hands gripping the rail until his knuckles whitened. "I just want to understand why," he said, voice cracked but steady. "Chains. A tree. Why do that to anyone? Why to them?" The questions had no answers yet, only echoes bouncing through the mountains, where silence still reigned. The detective returned to the forest, retracing paths Jack and Benjamin might have walked before their last moments. The leaves whispered underfoot, branches snapped, and birds scattered. He paused at the clearing where the tree stood, the chains now tagged and bagged, the bark scarred with their memory. He thought about Tin walking there in the dark, dragging his right foot, carrying tools of restraint. Did he choose the tree for its height, its obscurity? Or did he pick it because the land itself seemed willing to swallow cries whole? Back in town, the investigation pressed into the mechanics of Tin's life. They searched for vehicles with odd repair records and mechanics who remembered patching a clutch for a man who never gave his name. One remembered a truck bed, lined with old carpet, the kind used to muffle noise. Another recalled a customer who paid only in cash, always exact change, and never had a conversation. Patterns emerged. A man who slipped between towns, leaving just enough behind for the observant to follow. At night, the detective spread the files across his kitchen table. Each piece of evidence was a star, faint and cold. Together they mapped a constellation, a figure limping across counties, hiding in plain sight. Tin wasn't invincible, only methodical. And the method could be undone. The walls closed in further when forensic technicians enhanced the gas station footage. They isolated the brand of cigarettes tucked into his breast pocket. A generic label, cheap and harsh, sold only in certain outlets. That narrowed the search. The detective traced distribution routes, highlighted stores, and dispatched plainclothes officers to linger by counters, watching for a man whose gait betrayed him. Days passed. Then a call came from a clerk at a rundown market near the edge of the park. She said a man matching the photo bought smokes there once a week, never more, always on Fridays after dusk. She remembered because his voice made her uneasy, tinny and flat, and because he always smelled like burned oil. The detective drove there himself, parking across the street with headlights off. The photo on the seat beside him, he watched the door open and close, locals filing in for bread, for beer, for lottery tickets. Then, just past 7, he saw him. The limp, the slouched shoulders, the voice drifting across the lot like something metallic scraped thin. But instead of moving in, the detective stayed still, his breath shallow. This wasn't the moment. Not yet. He needed more than recognition, more than the weight of suspicion. He needed evidence that would anchor Tin to Jack and Benjamin, evidence no defense could shake. So he let him walk back into the night, the limp fading into shadow. The detective gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached, whispering into the silence. Soon. The stakeouts began quietly, almost humbly, as though the enormity of what was at stake might collapse under too much force. 2 unmarked sedans rotated shifts near the market where Tin bought his cigarettes. Their headlights off and radios muted, they blended into the forgotten rhythm of a roadside town. Officers worked in pairs, keeping logs in the dim glow of dashboard lights, times, movements, and scraps of overheard conversation. The work was monotony laced with dread, the sort of surveillance where one wrong move meant the subject disappeared again, slipping into the cracks he'd lived in for years. Tin's habits revealed themselves slowly. He arrived at the market on Fridays, never earlier than dusk, never later than 8. He wore the same jacket, frayed at the elbows, and carried himself with that distinctive drag of the right leg. He bought the same brand of cigarettes, sometimes adding a bottle of cheap whiskey, always paying in exact cash. Then he returned to his truck, a battered model whose plates were obscured under layers of dirt. He drove away without hurry, headlights flicking on, only once he was well down the road. Following him was a lesson in patience. Tin knew the back roads too well. He varied his route, sometimes looping twice through the same stretch of highway, other times taking abrupt turns onto gravel paths that spidered into the woods. It was as though he was testing the darkness, daring anyone to keep pace without being seen. More than once, officers had to pull off, headlights killed, listening to his engine fade into the trees. Each time, he vanished like a wisp of smoke. But even men who lived like ghosts left traces. The detective sifted through the logs, aligning times, distances, and fuel stops. The patterns hinted at a destination deep into the Smokies, where maps showed only logging roads and old mining trails swallowed by moss and roots. Somewhere back there, Tin had carved out a world, a place he trusted to hide him, a place he had once used to chain Jack and Benjamin Harper to a tree. The decision to move closer wasn't made lightly. A small team prepared, trading uniforms for plain clothes, pistols for cameras, and badges for notebooks. They would shadow Tin on foot, not just on the roads. The forest, after all, had always been his camouflage. To find him, they would need to become shadows themselves. One night, they followed his truck farther than before. The road narrowed to gravel, then dirt, then little more than ruts winding through dense undergrowth. At a bend marked by a rusted milepost, Tin pulled off and killed his lights. The investigators parked a half-mile back, boots crunching softly as they set off after him. The forest swallowed sound, but every so often, the scrape of his limp carried across the night, a faint rhythm of drag and step, drag and step. They followed it until they saw the outline of a cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, its roof sagging, its windows blacked with plywood. Tin's truck sat crooked beside it, tires sunk into mud. Smoke rose from a stovepipe, curling into the canopy. From within came the faint clatter of movement, the scrape of a chair, and the hiss of a match. One of the officers lifted binoculars, catching a glimpse through a crack in the wood. Shelves lined with jars, tools scattered on a table, and in the corner, something metallic glinting faintly in the firelight. The detective crouched in the brush, heart hammering. He had found Tin's sanctuary, but the image of that metal object haunted him. Was it a chain, another fragment of a past cruelty, or just the trick of light against tools? He could not yet risk discovery. They withdrew into the night, leaving Tin alone in the cabin with his secrets. The following days brought deliberation. The cabin gave them jurisdiction and grounds for a warrant if they could link it directly to Jack and Benjamin. But warrants required precision, and the Smokies demanded caution. A wrong move would send Tin fleeing again, deeper into the labyrinth of ridges and valleys where no patrol could reach him. Meanwhile, the Harper story returned to headlines. Newspapers carried their photographs alongside the blurred still of Tin at the gas station. Talk radio filled with speculation, callers debating whether justice was close or slipping further away. For Jack's sister, each new headline reopened the wound. She sat before cameras once more, her voice unsteady but firm. "I don't care how long it takes. I just want the man who chained my brother and nephew to answer for it." Her words became another weight on the detective's shoulders, pressing him forward. The break came not from Tin himself, but from the land around him. A hunter stumbled upon a clearing less than a mile from the cabin. At first glance, it looked unremarkable. A circle of scorched ground, a crude fire pit ringed with stones, and the remains of burned wood. But scattered nearby were fragments of glass bottles melted in the flames, and buried under ash, a buckle corroded with rust. When analyzed, the buckle matched the design of an old child's backpack, the very one Benjamin Harper had carried on the day he vanished. The forest had given up another piece of its secret. And with it, the cabin was no longer just a hermit's refuge. It was now a crime scene waiting to be opened. That night, the detective returned alone. He parked where gravel met dirt, Boots carrying him silently toward the cabin's glow. From within came the murmur of a radio and the metallic scrape of a tin cup on wood. He listened, memorizing every sound, every detail of how the man lived. He thought of Jack, of Benjamin, of the chains now bagged in evidence. And he whispered a promise into the trees. Not much longer. The warrant was signed at dawn, the judge's pen scratching across the paper, with a weight that settled over every person in the room. It wasn't just ink on parchment, it was permission to breach a silence that had lasted 3 years. By the time the first pale light spilled across the Smokies, a team of 6 officers in plain clothes and unmarked trucks rolled toward the cabin, hidden deep in the trees. They drove with headlights dimmed, radios muted, and windows cracked to catch the forest's whispers. The detective rode in the lead vehicle, the warrant folded in his jacket pocket, though he knew paper alone would not protect them if the man inside chose violence. They stopped short of the clearing, engines cut, and finished the approach on foot. Boots sank into damp earth, leaves crackled softly, and breath steamed in the cold morning air. The shack appeared slowly, its outline etched against the bruised sky, smoke curling faintly from the stovepipe. Tin's truck sat crooked as before, its tires sunk deeper into mud, its windshield smeared opaque with grime. The detective raised his hand, signaling silence. He stepped forward, with a voice that carried authority, but not threat. "State Police, we have a warrant." The forest swallowed the words, with no answer returning from the cabin. He repeated them louder, the syllables sharp as the crack of branches overhead. Still nothing, only the faint hum of the stovepipe and the soft rustle of unseen wings. The team breached the door. Hinges groaned, wood splintered, and the cabin surrendered its secrets to daylight. Tin sat at a table in the dim interior, exactly as though he had been waiting. A tin cup rested in his scarred hand, and a cigarette burned down to its final inch. His eyes lifted to the officers without fear or surprise. If anything, resignation pooled there, heavy as lead. He made no move, no protest, no denial. The detective read him his rights, each word flat in the stale air. Tin listened as though the script belonged to someone else, then allowed the cuffs to close around his wrists. The cabin itself was the real witness. Shelves sagged under jars of dried beans and rusted nails. A cot in the corner carried the shape of a body in its flattened stuffing. On the table lay a collection of tools, ordinary on their own but sinister in combination. A set of pliers, lengths of chain, and a half spool of paracord knotted the same way as the rope found near the tree. In the far corner stood a steel locker, padlocked shut. When officers cut it open, the air inside rushed out, damp and sour. Within lay objects too familiar to mistake: a child's torn jacket, a pair of mud-stained boots, and a small notebook swollen with moisture. The notebook belonged to Jack. The first pages held camping notes, supplies, trail routes, and sketches of ridgelines. Then the handwriting changed, the neat letters loosening into frantic scrawls. One entry read simply, "He watches even when I sleep." Another, "Benjamin asks when we can go home. I have no answer." The words collapsed at the end into smears where the ink had bled from tears or rain or both. Every artifact was photographed, catalogued, and bagged. Each one tethered Tin more tightly to the disappearance. The detective turned the pages with gloved hands, reading the final words Jack ever wrote, feeling the weight of a father's despair pressed into paper. He closed the notebook, throat tight, and whispered a promise only the dead could hear. "We found you." Outside, Tin sat in the mud beside his truck, guarded but calm. He smoked another cigarette, the cuffs at his wrists clinking faintly with each movement. When the detective approached, Tin spoke for the first time. His voice was strange and metallic, carrying the rasp of a throat long scarred. "You don't understand the mountain," he said. "It keeps what it wants." The detective studied him, the limp, the cigarette, and the voice that fit Benjamin's description like a key fitting a lock. He felt the years of searching condense into this moment, this man, this presence. Yet one question remained sharp as a blade. Why chains? Why a tree? What purpose lay in binding father and son in the silence of the Smokies? The answer was not in the cabin, not yet. The evidence spoke of cruelty, of captivity, of a man who saw others as possessions. But his motive was still buried deeper, in Tin's history, in the wilderness he had claimed as his accomplice. As Tin was led away, the detective stood at the threshold of the cabin, staring into the dim space that had held so much horror. He knew the investigation was far from over. There would be months of sifting through Tin's past, years perhaps of trial and testimony. But the chains had spoken, the tree had testified, and now the man who believed himself untouchable was shackled by the very system he thought he could evade. The trucks rumbled back down the logging roads, Tin in the back seat, the Smokies closing in behind them. The forest seemed unchanged, indifferent, but the detective knew it had shifted. It had given up one of its ghosts. The man who called himself Tin was booked into county, holding just after sundown. The fluorescent lights flattened his face into shadow and glare, making him look both older and younger, as though time had been uneven with him. He gave his name in a voice that rasped like metal dragged across asphalt, and though the paperwork recorded it neatly in black ink, no one on the investigative team trusted it. Men like him collected names the way they collected tools, functional, interchangeable, and discarded when worn. To the officers, he would remain Tin, the name Benjamin Harper had whispered 3 years before anyone believed it meant anything. The detective began the long work of excavation, not of soil, but of history. Tin's fingerprints were run through databases, clattering across servers that carried records of decades. Hits emerged like bones, rising through thawing ground. A trespassing charge in a neighboring state, dismissed when the complainant never showed. A disorderly conduct arrest in a river town, the details lost in smudged ink and faded signatures. Citations for expired plates, unpaid fines, and bench warrants that were issued and later voided. None of it amounted to the violence that Jack and Benjamin had endured. Yet the pattern was clear. A man who lived on the edges, always near enough trouble for his name to be written down, never enough for it to stick. Neighbors, if they could be called that, remembered fragments. A gas station attendant recalled him buying fuel late at night, never during daylight. A woman who once rented cabins nearby remembered his limp more than his face, the way his right boot dragged just a little when he carried wood. A mechanic spoke of a truck patched with salvaged parts, its bed lined with plywood stained dark. "He paid cash," the mechanic said, "and he never looked you in the eye." The pieces fit together into a silhouette of a man who existed everywhere and nowhere, who made his life in the gaps society never bothers to seal. The detective pressed harder, searching court records, tax archives, and property deeds. The cabin was not his by law. It had never been registered, never filed under any county. But 30 years earlier, a different parcel of land had been bought by a name that matched the one Tin had given on arrest. That property lay abandoned now. The house burned to ash long ago, its field overtaken by brush. The deed, though, revealed something chilling. The man had once been married. He had a son. Both were listed as deceased in a hospital record after a car accident that left Tin the sole survivor. The accident explained the limp, but investigators wondered if it explained more the bitterness in his voice, the paranoia in his habits, and the violence of his choices. Men break differently under grief. Some turn inward, some drink, and some wander, and some carve their pain into the lives of strangers. While Tin's history was stitched together in files and interviews, the forensic team combed through the cabin. Every drawer, every floorboard, every plank was treated as evidence. They found cigarette filters crushed into a coffee can, paracord scraps under the cot, and jars of nails and screws sorted with care that suggested obsession. In the shed behind the cabin, they found something worse. Buried beneath tarps was a set of metal restraints, welded crudely but functional. Shackles, not for animals, but for wrists and ankles. The steel was scarred with scratches, as though someone had struggled inside it. The items were bagged, labeled, and carried into the chain of custody. Each one layered more weight onto the case. The district attorney visited the evidence room personally, staring at the restraints for a long time before speaking. "This," he said, "is not the work of impulse. This is preparation." And yet, even with Tin behind bars, answers remained elusive. Why, Jack? Why, Benjamin? Why the tree in the Smokies, the chains that scarred bark and bone alike? Tin offered nothing in interrogation. He sat across from the detective, wrists cuffed, posture slouched, eyes half-lidded. He smoked when allowed and was silent when pressed. When the detective asked directly, "Why them?" Tin only exhaled smoke and said, "The mountain gives and the mountain takes. I only helped it along." His words were not confession so much as deflection, the creed of a man who wanted his crimes absorbed by the landscape itself. But the mountain had already betrayed him. The chain embedded in bark, the moss remembering where boots had stood, the clearing that gave up its silence. Nature had become the witness he could not silence. Back in town, Jack's sister followed the case with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. She attended hearings, sat in galleries, and stared at Tin with eyes that never blinked. Reporters asked her if she felt relief now that someone was in custody. She shook her head. "Relief comes when I understand why, and I don't think he'll ever tell us." Her words hung in the air, a reminder that justice and understanding are not the same thing. The detective shared that unease. He knew they had the evidence to hold Tin, to build a case so strong no jury could ignore it. But the story's core, the why, remained a hollow space. And in that space the memory of Jack and Benjamin lingered, not as a solved case but as a wound still raw. Late one night, he reopened Jack's notebook. He traced the words where the ink had blurred. "He watches even when I sleep." The detective closed the file and sat in silence, wondering if some truths are not meant to be unearthed. If the mountain keeps its darkest reasons hidden, even when it gives up the bodies. The courthouse became a vessel for silence before it became a stage for words. Every morning of the pre-trial hearings, people filed into the wooden benches, their coats damp from mountain rain, their faces drawn into expressions that wavered between grief and curiosity. They were not there to witness law alone. They were there to see the man who had haunted their valleys and hollows, the man whose limp and cigarette smoke had become myth. They wanted to see if he looked ordinary, if the monster could pass as a neighbor. Tin shuffled into the courtroom in shackles, his right leg dragging against the chain with the same uneven rhythm described in every report. His beard was trimmed short by jail clippers, his clothes were state-issued, and his wrists were cuffed in front of him. Yet nothing could blunt the strangeness of his presence. For 3 years he had been rumor and shadow, and now he was flesh sitting beneath fluorescent light. His eyes scanned the gallery without expression. He seemed neither ashamed nor proud. He simply was. The prosecutor laid the foundation brick by brick. Photographs of the tree where the chains had grown into bark. Images of the corroded shackles found in the shed. Jack's water-damaged notebook, its frantic script displayed on a projection screen, so the jury could see each word carved by desperation. The forensic analyst testified about the DNA pulled from cigarette filters and paracord, linking them to Tin's profile. The mechanic spoke of the plywood-lined truck bed. The store clerk described his metallic voice and the smell of oil and smoke that clung to him. Each piece on its own was a thread. Together, they wove a noose. The defense was sparse, reduced to cross-examinations that faltered under the weight of evidence. They argued chain of custody, questioned memory, and tried to peel away at the certainty of science. But the jury saw the tree, saw the photographs of Shackles, and read Jack's words. These were not abstractions. They were anchors. In the gallery, Jack's sister sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She refused to look at the images of the tree, but she listened to every word. When Jack's notebook was read aloud, her eyes welled, but she did not look away. She wanted Tin to see that she would bear the weight of her brother's last words. She wanted him to see she had not abandoned him, not even in this room. The community responded with a kind of collective exorcism. Old hunters who had dismissed the stories of chains in the Smokies now admitted they had always felt watched in certain hollows. Mothers pulled their children closer when walking trails, whispering warnings about strangers with limps. The local paper ran headlines that were less about law than about catharsis. "The Mountain Speaks," one read, above a photo of the chains coiled in an evidence bag. Radio call-in shows filled with voices repeating the same refrain. We always knew something was wrong out there. Yet for all the testimony, all the evidence, Tin himself remained unreadable. He rarely spoke, answering questions with monosyllables. When asked directly if he denied chaining Jack and Benjamin, he looked at the floor and said only, "The mountain keeps its own." His words were not defense but deflection, as though the forest itself were the true culprit and he was only its servant. The jury heard arrogance in his tone. Others heard madness. But to the detective seated behind the prosecutor, it sounded like surrender to the philosophy of a man who had no explanation and no interest in inventing one. The most haunting moment came when the forensic pathologist testified. He described in steady, clinical terms the condition of the remains, the growth of bark over chain, and the slow absorption of metal into wood. He explained how many seasons had passed, how the forest itself had borne witness. The jurors sat still, pens unmoving, as he concluded. The evidence is consistent with prolonged restraint. The individuals did not leave that place alive. The words dropped into the silence like stones into a well. Even Tin shifted slightly in his seat, his cuffs clinking faintly. For the first time, a flicker of something passed across his face, not regret, not fear, but recognition. He knew the truth had been spoken in terms he could not dodge. The trial stretched on, days bending into weeks, each one punctuated by more evidence, more testimony, and more attempts by the defense to pick at threads too strong to unravel. Reporters camped on courthouse steps, their cameras capturing not just the trial, but the mood of a town forced to reckon with the darkness living in its mountains. And still the question of why lingered. The prosecutor offered theories in closing arguments. Grief twisted into cruelty, isolation sharpened into violence, and the mountain itself becoming an altar for one man's obsession. But none of it felt whole. None of it filled the hollow at the story's center. The jury retired with binders of evidence and returned in less than 2 days. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: murder, kidnapping, and unlawful restraint. Tin stood as the words were read, his limp shifting his balance, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room. He did not flinch, did not sigh, and did not speak. The mountain had kept his secrets for 3 years, but the court had stripped them away in 3 weeks. Jack's sister wept quietly, her face pressed into her hands. The detective exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. And outside, the Smokies loomed indifferent, as though the trial had never happened. as though the chains and bark and silence were just another season passing. The day of sentencing drew a crowd that filled the courthouse long before the judge took the bench. People pressed into the gallery, lining the walls, their voices hushed as if they were entering a chapel rather than a room of law. Reporters clustered near the doors, their cameras lowered but ready, waiting for the moment when silence would break into finality. The case had ceased to be just about Jack and Benjamin Harper. It had become about the community itself, about the idea that something this brutal could take root in their mountains and survive unseen for years. Tin shuffled into the room under guard, the chains at his ankles scraping against tile. He wore the same orange uniform, the same expression of weary detachment. His limp pulled him slightly off balance as he stood before the judge, his hands folded loosely in front of him. To the gallery, he looked like a man hollowed out, not broken but emptied, as though whatever force had once driven him had burned away, leaving only a husk. The judge read the charges again, his voice echoing off wood-paneled walls. 2 counts of murder, 1 for Jack Harper and 1 for his son Benjamin. Additional counts for kidnapping and unlawful restraint. Tampering with evidence. Each word was heavy, the syllables striking like hammer blows. When he spoke of sentencing, the room seemed to hold its breath. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the judge declared. On each count, to be served consecutively. The gavel struck, final and resonant. In the gallery, Jack's sister wept openly, her shoulders shaking, but there was steel beneath her grief. She stood, eyes fixed on Tin, and spoke when the judge offered her the chance. Her words were halting at first, but they gathered strength, braided from years of waiting. "You thought you could hide them in silence," she said. "You thought the mountain would keep your secret, but the mountain spoke, and now everyone knows what you did." Her voice cracked, but did not falter. "You didn't win. Jack and Benjamin are remembered. You're forgotten, even now, even standing here." Tin did not look at her. His gaze drifted to the floor, to the cuffs at his wrists, as though the words could not pierce whatever void he carried inside. For a moment, though, the detective thought he saw the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, not remorse, not recognition, but annoyance, the reflex of a man unused to being confronted. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in a low, heavy cheer, not of joy but of release. Signs reading, "Justice for the Harpers," bobbed above heads. People embraced, tears shining in the afternoon light. For the community, the verdict was a kind of closure, even if imperfect. The mountain had given up its ghost, and justice had tethered it to human law. Yet for the detective, closure was a word he could not summon. He sat alone in his office that evening, the notebook still on his desk. Jack's words stared back at him, blurred in places, sharp in others. "He watches even when I sleep. Benjamin asks when we can go home." The detective traced the lines with his eyes, knowing that justice in a courtroom could never unwrite them. He wondered if the boy had known, in his last moments, that his words might one day be read in pursuit of truth. The trial had ended, but the aftermath rippled outward. Hikers returned to the Smokies with heavier steps, scanning trees with suspicion. Parents kept their children closer. Trailheads once filled with laughter now carried a hush. The forest itself seemed changed in reputation, no longer only beauty and refuge, but a place where cruelty had once rooted itself and left scars in bark and memory. Jack and Benjamin's family began the slow process of mourning not as an open wound, but as a scar that would never vanish. Vigils were held at the edge of the park, candles flickering against the dark backdrop of ridgelines. People told stories of Jack's patience, of Benjamin's curiosity, of lives cut cruelly short. The detective attended one vigil, standing at the back, his face half lit by flame. He listened as names were spoken into the night, carried upward on smoke, and absorbed by the same mountains that had once hidden them. Tin was transported to a state facility the following week, His limp dragged against concrete floors, his metallic voice answering intake questions with clipped replies. In prison, he became another number, another body in a system designed to erase individuality. But to the people of the Smokies, he would remain Tin, the man who chained a father and son to a tree, who mistook silence for protection, who believed cruelty could be buried in roots and soil. The detective drove into the mountains once more before sealing the file. He parked at the trailhead nearest the clearing, boots carrying him down the path where moss had regrown, where the bark still bore faint scars of iron. He stood in the quiet, the forest alive with its ordinary music, birds, wind, and the ripple of water over stone. And he thought about how the mountain was neither villain nor accomplice. It was the only witness. It had kept the truth long enough, then surrendered it when the time was right. He left a single flower at the base of the tree, its petals bright against dark earth. "You're home now," he whispered, though he knew home was no longer possible in the truest sense. It was a promise anyway, and sometimes promises are all the living can give to the dead. In the months after the sentencing, the story of Jack and Benjamin Harper began to take on a second life, not in courtrooms or evidence labs, but in memory, rumor, and folklore. The Smokies had always carried ghost stories in their folds. Miners lost in shafts, hikers vanishing into fog, strangers glimpsed at dusk and never seen again. Now the mountain had a new story, one rooted not in superstition but in fact. A father and son chained to a tree, their bodies claimed by silence for 3 long years until the wilderness itself surrendered the truth. Locals spoke of the clearing in hushed tones. Some avoided it altogether, convinced the land there would never feel right again. Others sought it out, standing at the scarred tree as if in pilgrimage, their fingers brushing the bark where iron had once been swallowed. They left flowers, carved initials, and whispered prayers. The chains were gone, sealed in evidence, but the ghost of their presence lingered like a bruise. Even children growing up after the trial would hear the story from parents who used it as a warning. Don't stray from the trail, don't trust strangers, and remember what happened to the Harpers. For the detective, the case clung to him long after the files were boxed and archived. He carried Jack's notebook in his thoughts, the desperate scrawl of a father who had known his end was near. Some nights, he dreamed of the words as though they were carved into the walls of his own house, as though the plea Benjamin asks, "When can we go home?" had been meant for him personally, a request he had failed to answer for 3 years. He tried to bury the dreams in work, in new cases, but the Smokies followed him. Every time he drove past the ridgelines, he saw not beauty, but a reminder that wilderness can swallow secrets whole and only return them when it chooses. The community, too, bore the case as a scar. Tourism brochures still showed waterfalls and autumn colors, but beneath the surface, locals traded glances when strangers appeared at trailheads. Hikers found themselves explaining their routes twice, reassuring worried innkeepers that they'd be back by nightfall. Rangers patrolled more often, eyes sharper, voices firmer when reminding visitors of rules. The Smokies had not changed in shape, but their reputation had shifted, weighted now by a story that could never be untold. Folklore began to form around Tin himself. People said his limp could still be heard on foggy nights, his dragging step echoing down empty trails. Some swore his metallic voice carried through hollows like the groan of wind. Others claimed the mountain would not hold him long, that men like him left stains deeper than prison walls could contain. Rational voices dismissed such talk, but the whispers persisted. Fear, after all, is as much a part of mountains as stone and soil. Jack's sister became an advocate, her grief sharpening into purpose. She spoke at schools, telling children about safety in the wilderness, about vigilance, and about the importance of being remembered. She told them her brother and nephew were not statistics, not headlines, but people who had laughed and played and dreamed. Her words traveled farther than the Smokies, reaching families in other towns and other states. Out of tragedy, she forged a legacy of caution and remembrance. The detective met her once more at a vigil a year after the sentencing. The crowd gathered at the trailhead where Jack and Benjamin had last been seen, candles trembling in the wind. She spoke softly to him, thanking him for not giving up, for following trails others had dismissed. He nodded but said little, because he carried the truth she already knew, that justice had been done, but it had not healed the wound. That night, driving home, he pulled over at an overlook. The mountains stretched beneath a moon that painted them silver, endless folds of shadow and light. He lit a cigarette, though he hadn't smoked in years, the taste harsh, the sound of the match scratching loud in the stillness. He thought of Tin's words, "The mountain keeps its own," and wondered if in some way they were true. Perhaps the wilderness did keep secrets, but it also chose when to give them up, when to bend branches and reveal bones, and when to let the truth surface through roots and moss. He exhaled smoke and whispered into the night, a vow spoken not to Tin, not to the court, but to Jack and Benjamin. "I'll remember you," because memory, he realized, was the only thing that outlasted both justice and cruelty. The Smokies would outlive them all, but memory gave shape to silence. Memory made sure that chains were not the last word. 3 summers after the trial, hikers paused at the trailhead where Jack and Benjamin Harper had last been seen. A small wooden bench stood there now, set back from the gravel parking lot beneath a canopy of maple and oak. A plaque, fixed to the backrest, bore their names, not in grand lettering, but in quiet script, the kind meant to be read by those who sat down and let the weight of the forest settle on them. Sometimes there were flowers left at its base, sometimes smooth river stones stacked carefully, tokens of strangers who had carried the story with them. The Smoky Mountains, vast and indifferent, rolled on as they always had. Mist still spilled through the valleys each morning, and deer still crossed the trails in silence. Yet for those who knew, the landscape was no longer just beauty, it was a reminder. It was proof that wilderness does not distinguish between the lost and the hunted, between chance misstep and deliberate cruelty. Jack and Benjamin had entered these woods for peace, and for years they had been held in its silence, chained not only to a tree, but also to the weight of unanswered questions. When the answers finally came, they arrived like jagged stones. The truth of their captivity, the horror of their final days, and the cold calculations of a man who had convinced himself that possession was power, all of it had left marks deeper than bark or soil. The trial ended with a sentence, but the wound did not close. Justice had been delivered in name, but peace was something no court could give. Those who loved them learned to carry absence as if it were an object. Jack's sister kept his old guitar in her living room, though it had gone unplayed for years. Benjamin's childhood drawings, saved by his mother, curled at the edges with time but remained pinned to a corkboard, the colors fading but the shapes still vivid enough to recall the hand that made them. Memory became a second language, spoken in small rituals and private silences. The detective who had worked the case never walked the mountains the same way again. Trails he once saw as paths for escape now looked like threads leading into shadow. He knew how easy it was for footsteps to vanish, for a voice to echo and be swallowed. Yet he also knew that persistence could cut through even the deepest silence, that truth could be forced from rock if one kept pressing. Sometimes, when he stood before a jury in new cases, he carried Jack's notebook in his mind, the desperate words written by a father determined not to vanish without record. It reminded him that every unsolved case was not just a puzzle, but a plea waiting to be answered. In time, the story of Jack and Benjamin Harper settled into something larger than an investigation. It became a warning passed from ranger to hiker, from parent to child. Do not stray. Do not trust lightly. Remember those who walked before you and did not return. The Smokies held many legends, but this one was carved in fact, bound by testimony, and sealed by a courtroom gavel. And yet, in its retelling, it began to sound like folklore, a tale of a father and son who went into the forest and were chained by darkness until the mountain, at last, gave them back. At the bench by the trailhead, people still sit. Some say nothing, letting the wind through the leaves speak for them. Others whisper prayers or promises, words the mountains carry upward. A few bring their children, pointing to the plaque and telling the story in fragments, teaching them that beauty can conceal danger and that safety is a choice made with vigilance, not assumption. The bench becomes not just a memorial but a threshold, a place where the past leans into the present, where silence speaks if you listen long enough. And so, the tale closes not with triumph, but with remembering. Jack and Benjamin Harper will never walk these trails again, but their story ensures no one forgets that they once did. Their names live in the wind that threads the ridges, in the mist that drapes the valleys, and in the hush that falls each evening when the mountains remind all who enter. Some silences are chosen, and some are not. If you found yourself immersed in this story and want to hear more haunting accounts where wilderness, mystery, and human choices collide, make sure to subscribe. Your support allows these stories to keep being told, so the names of the lost are never swallowed by silence again.